So today we are talking about this next section of Dream of Scipio. And as I said to you when we began part 2 of this book, in part 1 we got to sort of see some of the nature of the characters that we had. So we got a feel for who Julien is, for who Olivier is, although we saw less of him in part 1 than we do in part 2. And of course we also see Manlius, right? We see their relationships, we see their friendships, we see the people that they love. Except for Olivier, we don't really see Rebecca until part 2, right? But now in part 2, as I said, we start to see the crisis that each one of them begins to be faced with, right? That we see that there are conflicts between their friendship, right? Their private friendship, the people rather that they love and that they care about that are their private friendship, whether it's their lover or their close friend, right? And the way in which that conflicts with their public duties, right? Whether it's as a citizen or as a politician or as a leader, right? All of those different ways in which we see that there is that conflict between the public and the private, right? Remembering that when we started looking at this book, right, and even when we see the picture as well is on the front of our syllabus, is that picture of Raphael, remember, with the sleeping knight, and on either side, right? We see on one side is the public figure of duty, the law, right? And on the other side we see the lover with the flower, and that represents his private love and friendship, right? So that conflict between those two things. And as we said, what makes this really difficult for these characters is that, as we saw with Altier, right, who gives us a sort of like a small but very important lead-in example to some of these conflicts, some of these difficulties, is that when these choices have to be made, it's not an easy choice between, oh, this one choice is better than the other choice. Instead, it turns out that choosing one thing or choosing the other is in many ways what we call a lose-lose situation, right? That if you choose one thing, it's terrible, it's awful, right? But if you chose the other thing, make the other choice, then it's also going to have terrible consequences, right? So as we saw with Altier, right? Remember, his choices were, on the one hand, he could try to save his friend Olivier, betray the Cardinal Dodot for whom he works, but then he would lose everything, right? All the privileges, his career, all that he would lose, right? On the other hand, he could continue to work for the Cardinal Dodot, and in the process, he would, if he hadn't died of the plague, he would lose Olivier, his great friend, right? So for him, it's almost an impossible choice that we see before him. And as I said, we increasingly will start to see our 3 main characters, Olivier, Julien, and Manlius, also are confronted with those kinds of lose-lose choices, right? Where they're faced with, they have to choose between 2 different things, between their public duty and their private love, private friendship, and in making those choices, they have to make some terrible sacrifices along the way. Okay. All right, so as I've done before, to help you keep track of the different threads of the story, here's a quick synopsis, quick overview of what happened in our reading for today. First of all, we saw that, remember, his friend, childhood friend and now adult friend, Marcel, had asked Julien to help with the tasks of the government, not to serve actually in the government or as an official, but to continue his work as a professor, right? To go out there, to give lectures, to talk about history, to talk about philosophy, right? To talk about his ideas, and to give the French people a sense that things were still at some level kind of normal, right? That they were still living in a regular country, in a normal country where people were still going to class and learning things and giving lectures and all that sort of stuff, right? So Marcel, we saw he wants him to continue giving these lectures, although as we start to see, it's a kind of a censored or a narrow version of what Julien might normally talk about, right? Insofar as like Marcel starts to tell him, well, maybe you don't want to talk about that topic. Maybe you want to avoid this. Talk about this instead. Right? And one of the things that he does talk about, and is something to keep in mind for later on, because we do get a different perspective on this later on, is a historical talk that Julien gives about the Avignon papacy, right? The popes at Avignon, with a particular focus on this guy, Pope Clement, right, whom we meet in the course of our reading for today, right? Pope Clement, and remember also Altier had talked about Pope Clement as well before, because he had met him before he became the Pope. Remember his name before he became Pope was Pierre Roger, and he was the one that put to death the Cathars, right, who had been put on trial. But Julien looks back at Pope Clement, and he looks around at the prejudice and the treatment of the Jews that he sees around him, and he thinks back, remember the time of Pope Clement, when Pope Clement had stepped in when people were blaming the Jews for the Black Death, for the plague, and Pope Clement had stepped in and he had issued a decree that no one was to harm the Jews and no one was to blame them for the plague. And he thinks, if only there was someone like Pope Clement around, what a good pope he must have been. And he wishes that there was more of that kind of mercy in his time. Right? Now, as I said, we'll get a rather different perspective on that later in the novel. So Julien, he talks about this example, but Marcel says, Julien, please don't talk about Jews. Just, I know you're interested in this topic. I know it's part of your history, but it's kind of touchy right now. So let's not talk about that. Right? So he kind of we start to see some censorship exercised by Marcel. It's also around this time that Julien discovers that Claude Bronson, remember, after the Last Supper together, Claude Bronson had said that he was going to go and meet up with Julia, and that he would take care of her, and they would escape together from the Nazis. But Julien finds out, of course, he didn't know until this point that Claude had actually died in a concentration camp. So he goes to see Marcel, and he says, what's going on? Like, why did he die in a concentration camp? And Marcel says, don't worry, it's not really that bad. It's just to protect them. Right? They're just there. It's just a processing place for people who don't have, the right, papers and the right visas and so on. It just must have been an accident that he died, right? Of course, we know the truth is that, the Nazis actually were executing Jews actively in these places. Nonetheless, Julien uses his contact with Marcel. Remember, we saw that their friendship was based upon use value. Right, so we see that Julien is useful to Marcel for keeping the sense of normalcy in France and in his region of France, and in turn, Marcel helps him by getting him, helping him to find out what happened to Julia. Right. So he manages to locate Julia, Marcel does, and tells Julien where she is, and she is hiding in a place in Marseille. Right? Does this have a parallel to something we saw earlier in the story? Who else was having trouble hiding out in Marseille? Sophia, right? Remember in the Manlius story, right? When Sophia, remember originally her place as a teacher and that her school and so on were located in Marseille. And then things start to get very difficult there, and Manlius steps in and he rescues her and he brings her away, right? So there's a deliberate parallel between those two storylines, right? Lots of echoes between the three of the different stories. So he goes to find her. He finds that Julia is in a very strangely, even though she's in great danger and she's discovered that her father is dead, that she seems to have a strange sort of new sense of freedom about her life. Even though these are things that she should feel unhappy about, and she does, obviously, she nonetheless says, I sort of feel different. She goes off and she goes off for the day, and she makes some very cleverly counterfeited visas for herself, and she tells Julianne, it's strange, you know, I have this weird status in this country now, because even though I was not, my father was Jewish, but I don't feel Jewish. I didn't go through any of the rituals. I wasn't raised as a Jew, right? I also was born in Germany, but I lived most of my life in France. I have French citizenship, and yet she's seen as neither truly French and as Jewish, right? And so she has this very strange status that she has in this time. So Julian, he sells his painting, his Cézanne painting, right, which, you know, would be worth millions now, like millions and millions, to raise money for her escape. And she, as I said, she fakes these documents using her skills as an artist. Then we jump to the time of Olivier, and we see that Cardinal Dodot and Cardinal Ciccani are trying to outmaneuver each other over the question of whether the papacy should stay in Avignon, right? So remembering Dodot, he's French, right? The Pope, Clement, also French, right? Whereas Ciccani is Italian, and he wants the papacy to move back to Rome, right? So what he's trying to negotiate with is he's trying to get the countess who owns this part of the country. He's trying to get her to sell the land, right? Dodot is trying to get her to sell the land to the Pope, so that the Pope will own Avignon, and therefore will probably never move from there if that happens. Right? So there's all these outside negotiations, political movements that are going on. Then we see that Gersonides, right? Gersonides, the Jewish scholar that Olivier has been consulting with and who works, as we've seen, for Cardinal Dodot, he is brought to Avignon, right, in order to consult about the plague, right? Because he's so widely read, he's read about plagues in other books and other times, and so they want to see if he can use his knowledge to research how to stop this particular plague. We see that Olivier sends for Gersonides, and he asks him a series of questions, right? And he says, like, well, how do you know this, or how do you interpret this? And he starts to get annoyed with him. He says, like, why don't you answer any of my questions? Why do you keep giving me more questions? And remember, this is where Gersonides says, well, this is the way of a real scholar. This is the way of a real thinker, is that we don't just answer questions and then stop, right? We keep on asking questions. That's the nature of learning, right? This is a style, obviously, very much modeled after the Greek philosopher Socrates. Remember, Socrates famously says that he doesn't know anything, and he knows that he doesn't know anything, and therefore his style is to ask questions. What do you mean by, you know, justice? What do you mean by this term you mean? What do you mean by this? And so he keeps on asking questions, and that's his style of learning. And of course, this is the style of learning that's become a big part of Western culture ever since, right? And obviously, I hope you can see this style in my own teaching, in asking you questions. What do you think is the most important? Seen from the text, why is it important? What does this symbol mean, right? These kinds of things, asking questions constantly about what the text is doing. Okay? Gersonides does help him, but as he looks at Olivier, he realizes that Olivier is very similar to him, right? He has the same hunger for knowledge, same kinds of questions that he's asking, and that he's in pursuit of these same kinds of ideas. Gersonides is then summoned before the Pope, Pope Clement, who's taking all sorts of strange precautions against the plague. So he has, like, furnaces and onion baths and other weird stuff that he's doing to try and avoid the plague. We see that both the Pope and Gersonides are very learned. They can speak several different languages. They're very knowledgeable. They speak to each other very directly, right? So remembering that there is a huge difference in, like, social prestige between, obviously, the Pope and anyone else within that society, but especially between Gersonides, who is, like, second-class citizen as being a Jew, but nonetheless they speak to each other very directly as equals in this scene. And Gersonides says, I need my books, I need my research materials in order to find out more about the plague, and so the Pope sends someone to get them for him. We then jump to Manlius, right? And Manlius decides that he doesn't really have many options for trying to persuade King Gundobad, right, who was the barbarian king, to side with him, to make an alliance with him. So he decides that the only way that he can really do it, because he can't impress him with lots of money, he doesn't have that. He can't impress him with how powerful he is with all of his armies, because he doesn't have those either. So he instead tries to impress King Gundobad with being cultured, being learned, right? So he sends him books and other things and scholars and so on to impress him with civilized learning. All right, then we jump back to Julien, and Julien is concerned about the fact that the authorities are burning books and getting rid of books from the libraries and so on that they don't agree with, and some of them are obvious sort of choices like Karl Marx and so on. But then he becomes particularly concerned that they're even banning famous literary works, right? So even Walter Scott, he's like, how could that be? How could that offend anyone? How could that hurt anyone to read Walter Scott? So Julien thinks for a moment, should I resign? Should I quit? Should I quit in protest? And then he thinks, no, see, if I quit, then I'll just be replaced by someone who's even worse, someone who will do whatever Marcel tells him to do. So if I stay here, at least I can try and negotiate a better position. Unfortunately, he very quickly finds out how hard that is to negotiate those sorts of things, because Marcel tells him to deal with a situation where there's a newspaper, they've been printing things that are against the government, and they have a Jew as one of their reporters. And he's told, look, you have a choice. Either you fire the Jewish guy, fire the Jewish reporter, or we close down the whole newspaper and everyone loses their jobs. Right? And Julien's like, well, I guess I've got to make a choice, right? I guess one guy losing his job is better than 10 guys losing their job, so all right, I guess I'll have to ask them to fire the Jewish guy. Right? And he starts to find that this pattern repeats itself over and over, right? That he's asked to do more and more of these kinds of things. And it becomes more and more difficult for him to justify his position, right? Luckily, however, there's sort of like a little token joke at the end. Nonetheless, he manages to make it so that if someone specially requests to see Walter Scott, they can read his novels, all right? Okay, so that's where we are at with our reading for today. That's a brief overview of what we're reading. Now, I want to focus today upon an idea that we have touched upon previously. When we were in our last discussion, we were talking about how there is a parallel that is sometimes made between the Germans of World War II and the barbarians who are invading the Roman Empire, right? So occasionally there is this parallel that is made between the two of them, insofar as like one appears to be attacking civilization and the other is trying to defend it. However, we saw that this situation is kind of complicated by the fact that when we look at the modern Germans, the Germans of the 20th century, that in reality, their culture is not barbaric, right? It's not barbaric insofar as they have famous composers, famous authors, famous philosophers, you know, and so on. They do have all of these hallmarks of a sophisticated, educated culture, right? Even though they are being, in this sort of story, are being cast by Julien, by Marcel, as being the barbarians, right? So this leads us to have to rethink our ideas about the differences between civilization, barbarism, and culture and its relation to like evil and cruelty, right? Because the long-standing assumption is that if you are barbaric, if you are uneducated, if you are unsophisticated, that this is going to lead you to be cruel and mean and evil and like, you know, warlike. Whereas if you are civilized, you are going to be sophisticated and compassionate and caring, right? That these are the expectations that a lot of our characters work, particularly Julien, work with, and that are assumptions of our society. And yet, when we look closely at what this happens in this story, we see that some of those assumptions are not entirely true, right? In fact, are shown to be quite false in many occasions. So let's begin with Julien and his view of France, right? Remember, he sees France, and he's not the only one who sees France this way, he sees France as a civilized country, right? A country that epitomizes, in many ways, civilization, right? And modern France, and France of the last few centuries, certainly thinks of itself in this way as well, right? This is because, you know, when we think of France, and particularly Paris, what are some of the things that we think of? What do we associate with that place and that country? Yes, there's certainly sort of a romantic sense, and it's a city that's associated with, you know, love and passion and so on. Yes, that's one thing. What are some of their famous cultural products that we associate with France? Spirit of French Revolution, but at the moment, I'm thinking about like today. What are some of the other things that we, certainly like love and romance is one place that's very popular for honeymoons and stuff like that. So fashion is something that speaks to us about sophistication, doesn't it, right? Fashion is something that we associate with being cool, with being sophisticated, with being civilized, right? It's not something that, like, you know, people who are either poor or unsophisticated or lack learning are the centerpiece of. This is for rich, sophisticated, educated people who are into fashion, right? So fashion, what else? One other thing particularly mentioned of. Art, yes, although New York has become probably overtaken somewhere like Paris as the center, the world center for art. Although up until probably the middle of the 20th century, yes, Paris was very much a focus for art and for literature, right, worldwide. But now probably New York has overtaken that mantle. Think about places that even around Seoul that have the name of food, right? So tous les jours, Paris baguette, right? Why are they called these names? Because they're associated with French food, and French food, is it for poor people? Is it ordinary kind of food? No, it's associated with cordon bleu, right? The high, expensive, sophisticated style of eating, right? So even the kind of, like, even though like France may not be at the forefront of our consciousness, right? It may not be the thing that we think about all the time. Nonetheless, we can even see that just a quick sort of survey, a quick thinking about some of the things that we associate with France, fashion, food, romance, like these things are all seen through the filter of being extremely sophisticated, extremely civilized, right? So France has this long-standing modern reputation as being a center of civilization, of culture, of sophistication, right? So we see that this is something that, like, Julien, he sort of buys into this, right? He, especially as someone who's been sort of educated through the French system, which is another part of that sort of French, self-perception, is that their education system, maybe not at every level, but certainly at the elite level, right, is seen as very good. Then the thing that Julien then sort of mistakes about the French past is that he thinks, oh, well then it must have always been this way, right? We French, it must be just part of the air that we breathe, and part of the soil, and part of the way what it means to be French. And he projects this back on, for example, to his understanding of Pope Clement, right? So when he gives his lecture about Pope Clement and how Pope Clement protected the Jews, he's like, this is very French of him, right? Like we French, you know, it must have been because he was French that he protected them, that he did this great act. So it says on 126 of our course packet, would he have done such a thing had he not been French? This is Julien thinking, right? This is for reason and mercy was bred in the soil of France, breathed in the air. It was part of the national spirit, right? This is Julien's opinion, not the narrator's. This is Julien's opinion, okay? So he has this sort of this very romanticized view of his country and of France as being this bastion, this place of freedom. It's in the soil, it's in the air, it's just in who we are, he thinks. However, Ian Pears is not that naive, right? First of all, Ian Pears is English, so he's going to be a little more critical. Although he speaks fluent French, and he lived in France as a journalist for a while, so he does know both sides of the equation. However, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Is that we're not supposed to take this opinion of Julien's at face value. We're not just supposed to accept it. We're not supposed to say, oh yes, those French, how wonderful they are, right? How full of freedom and mercy they really are. No, right? We're supposed to take this critically, right? Now, the first thing that we see in the novel that contradicts this or that modifies this position, right, is that the way in which many of the French people act in this novel does not fit with this romanticized picture that Julien has, right? So remember we saw the conversation between Ricimer and Manlius in our earlier reading, right? Where Ricimer says to him, look, the Romans, they used to be great. There was a time when they had that Roman spirit, but it's gone now, right? The Romans here, they're becoming barbaric. They don't really care about their civilization. In fact, they're not even really willing to defend it anymore, right? And there is something similar here that happens during the occupation of France by the Germans as well, right? I mentioned to you that this has been a part of sort of a national shame within France, is the extent to which many French people collaborated or helped the Germans. Even though after the war, many of them were like, oh yeah, no, I was part of the resistance. I totally hated the Germans. But during the war, many of them did collaborate, and many of them kept it a secret that they did so, right? And so the extent of the collaboration, the extent of that was something that has been hidden. So as we see here, many of the French, like we do see, obviously there is some resistance, but there is also collaboration that goes on as well during the war that is shameful and that afterwards is hidden. The second, however, and this is even more interesting, is that when we go back to the first timeline, the first storyline of Manlius, France is not a civilized country. In fact, most of France during Manlius's time, right, and we're talking here about King Uric, right, remember who's threatening them from the west, King Gundobad to the north, they're barbarians, right? In other words, most of France is a barbarian country, right? Now, we've got to remember too that the France that we know today, and in fact, this is true of most of the countries that exist today, didn't exist in those times, right? In Manlius's time, the country we know as France, it was instead a series of rather smaller states. And you can see here, this is the Roman Empire in 500, right? So just a short while after Manlius's time, right? And you can see here, it's a little hard to see, but the colors, this is where Manlius is, right? This is where Manlius is living down in this southern part of France, right? And these are the Burgundians, right? This is King Gundobad, right? This is where King Uric, who is threatening to invade, right, is coming from. And you can see this is all connected here to the Rome, which is down here, okay? So, and this northern kingdom, which was to become France itself, because you can see it's named after the Franks. The Franks were the tribe that ran that part of France. That's where we get the name France from, from the Franks. So you can see all of this part, except for this southern part, all of this is barbarian, right? All of this is uncivilized. I mean, at various parts it was part of the Roman Empire, but for the most part, you can see it is not civilized. It is not sophisticated. It is not part of that kind of civilization that Julien later comes to romanticize about all of France, right? So clearly, if we were to look at this map in 500, right, and think about Julien saying, oh yeah, this freedom and mercy and rationality is in the French soil, we'd be like, wait a minute, no it's not. That's a barbarian, and there's a barbarian, and there's a barbarian, right? And it's clearly not that way at all, right? So France has changed over the centuries. We can see it used to be a series of barbarian tribes, right? And it is only in the last few centuries that it has changed, the French culture has changed into one that is much more the sophisticated culture that we associate with its philosophy, its science, its food, its fashion, etc., right? That it's become over the last few centuries. And we can even see this in some of the historical references. First of all, we've seen the importance of the destruction of the Cathars and Catharism, right? We've talked about them. Remember, they were the Neoplatonic offshoot of Christianity, right? That the Catholic Church decided, nope, these are a bunch of heretics. These are a threat to Catholicism, and therefore in what was called the Albigensian Crusade of the early 1200s, remember, they wiped out or sent into hiding the Cathars, right? That we talked about at the beginning of our look at this novel, right? But the other thing that did was it also destroyed many of much of the power of those southern rulers. It destroyed their culture, destroyed their language, but it also destroyed the power of the southern rulers that allowed the northern king, right, of the Franks to eventually come down and to conquer the rest of France, right? So it was actually, it also allowed the unification of France to some extent. Now, these French are so associated with barbarism in those centuries that we actually saw in our earlier reading as well. We see Cicciani, remember, who is Italian and therefore, and a Roman who therefore thinks that he is from the most sophisticated, rational, enlightened people in the world. All right? In his biased case, in his prejudiced case, he thinks of them as also barbarian. He says, Avignon was an extra offense to God. Remember, this is his argument about returning to Rome. Avignon was an extra offense to God. As long as the papacy was there, it was subject to France, that barbarian nation from the north. Right? So Cicciani himself thinks of France. Remembering to compare this to what Julien later says, oh no, we French are naturally civilized. It's in the soil, it's in the air, it's how we think, right? And we see, of course, this is not at all true, right? France has been barbarian, it has been civilized, there's nothing natural about either of those things. So what we're seeing here is one of those historical reversals, just like we've seen several other times in the novel, right? So remember, Sophia, for example, is the Neoplatonist philosopher who is, strongly critical of Christianity, who is then transformed by history into Saint Sophia, right? Or the monastery that we saw, like from when Altier and Olivier are staying there, it collapses after the plague and then gets turned into a school for the French Revolution, which was a secular movement, right, against the church. Right? So these things that are transformed from one thing into their historical opposite, this is what happens with France itself. It's a barbarian nation that then gets transformed throughout history, and suddenly it emerges as a very civilized kind of place. Right? So we have this historical reversal going on. And as I said, it's this image of France that's changed from being a barbarian nation to being one that's associated, as we've seen with some of our earlier examples, with fashion and food and so on. But also there are a number of other examples that we could point to, historical examples that we could point to. For example, to the court of King Louis XIV, the famous Sun King, right? You can see him there. Why don't people dress like that today? Look at that. Look how good. Imagine how good I would look in that outfit, right? That long flowing hair, some hose. You guys don't imagine it. And this is, of course, the famous palace that he built, Versailles, right? So near to Paris. It's just the epitome of wealth and luxury and sophistication, right? Of course, built from money stolen from the poor people, but nonetheless. And we can also see that the French have a long history of intellectual achievements. So you can see here on the left this is René Descartes, right? One of the great Enlightenment thinkers, famous for that saying, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, right? And one of many, many, many famous thinkers and writers and artists that, as we said, have been associated with France over the last few hundred years. And of course, we can also see the effects of the French Revolution, right? This is a painting of Marie Antoinette having just had her head chopped off, right? Maybe not the figure of civilized sophistication, but nonetheless, it was an event that was very important in not just in French history, but in world history, in spreading the ideas about equality and democracy throughout the world. So, even today, of course, France still sees itself as a kind of cultural leader, as a center of sophistication, right? We see that it has more competitors these days in places like New York and perhaps London, but I'm not so willing to give that one up. But in terms of art and literature, right, it has more competitors, but still it is seen as a center of civilization. So what this novel gets us to do by comparing these things by getting us to compare civilization with barbarism, is it's leading us back to this question about like what kinds of behavior is seen as good or bad by human beings. What is its root? And for Julian, its root seems to be whether you are civilized or whether you are barbaric, right? So if you're educated, if you're civilized, Julian seems to have this idea that this will lead you to be a good person, a good friend, a good citizen, right? This will lead you to see your actions and to lead you to be virtuous, to be a good person, right? To be a good society. Whereas, on the other hand, the flip side to that is that he sees barbarism, being uneducated, uncultured, as being the source of evil deeds, of cruelty, of murder, of conquest, right? And he sees them in these very black and white kind of terms. Whereas the novel starts to ask this question, well, isn't it possible that civilization, being civilized, being educated, right, being sophisticated, is actually not proof, does not stop a society from doing very horrible, evil, nasty things to other people. Right? And this is the kind of question that is being asked both of us, of Julia, like of all of these different characters that appear to us in the novel. Because we start to see that even though, as I mentioned, this term barbarism or being barbaric seems often to connect being uneducated, being crude, not caring about sophisticated cultural things, to doing those evil, cruel things, right? We start to see that actually civilized people, and this is particularly where we get to the later parts of the novel, seem to be just as capable of doing cruel, evil things. So this is where Julian's logic starts to fall apart, doesn't it? Because it seems to say, well, being educated or not being educated is the difference between being a good person and being a cruel, evil person. Whereas we start to see that this novel pulls apart those opposites. And instead says, well, actually, right, it is possible in certain circumstances. We start to see that there are barbarians in the novel who actually turn out to be more sympathetic, who actually have a sense of conscience, and yet who still remain crude and uneducated. And on the other side of the equation, we start to see, and this is the more scary, the darker side, is that we see that there are some very educated, sophisticated people who nonetheless lack a sense of virtue and who are willing to do cruel and evil and murderous things, even though they listen to the finest music, taste the finest wines, eat the best food, go to the best schools, read the best books, right? And so that line between barbarism and civilization in terms of virtue of doing good things is not as simple as it first seems. Okay, I've asked everyone, I think, today. Yes, good. All right, so let's leave it there for today. Please hand in your prep sheets as you go, and I'll see you on Thursday. Just 2 more weeks after this one, and then finals.